400 feet below the surface of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Thomas Kellerman held his lantern at arm's length and watched the flame do something it should not have done. It bent, not from his movement, not from a draft he could feel. The flame pulled toward the shaft opening behind him, stretched horizontal for 3 full seconds, then slowly straightened. Kellerman stood motionless. The other miners had stopped talking. In the silence of the gallery, he counted to himself. 28 seconds. The flame bent again, this time away from the shaft, toward the working face where iron ore lay exposed in rusty veins. No one spoke. The lantern flames throughout the gallery moved in unison, bending in the same direction at the same moment, as if pulled by invisible hands. Kellerman set his lantern on the floor and knelt beside it. The dust near the base stirred in a slow circle, lifted slightly, then settled. He could not feel wind on his face. He could not hear air moving through the passages, but the dust confirmed what the flames showed. The mine was breathing. This was the Riverside Iron Mine in 1890, one of dozens of deep shafts cut into the Marquette Iron Range. It descended vertically for 600 feet before branching into horizontal galleries where crews extracted hematite ore. The mine had been operating for 8 years without incident. Ventilation came from a single timber-lined shaft and a secondary escapement tunnel, both connecting to the surface. No fans ran during this period. Airflow, when it occurred, moved by natural convection, warm air rising, cool air sinking. But what Kellerman observed that October morning was not simple convection. The air moved in cycles, inward toward the shaft for roughly 30 seconds, still for 10, then outward toward the galleries for another 30. The pattern repeated without variation, measurable by lantern flame and the drift of coal dust from the tramway. Some of the older miners had noticed it weeks earlier, but said nothing, attributing it to changes in weather or shifts in underground water. By mid-October, it could no longer be ignored. The breathing was regular, it was predictable, and it grew stronger the deeper you descended. Kellerman rose and walked to the edge of the main shaft, where a wooden cage descended into darkness. He held his lantern over the opening. The flame bent sharply downward, pulled toward the depths as if the mine were inhaling. He stepped back. The flame returned to vertical. He waited. After 30 seconds, the flame bent outward, and he felt a faint coolness on his face. Not wind, but a change in pressure, subtle enough that he questioned whether he had imagined it. He had not. Every man in that gallery felt it, and over the coming weeks it would become impossible to ignore. By late October, the mine foreman, Daniel Hackett, had begun logging the occurrences. He was a practical man, trained in surveying and experienced in the behavior of deep shafts. He did not believe in mysteries, but he respected patterns, and the breathing followed a pattern that troubled him. It occurred most strongly at 2 times each day, once in the early morning, between 6 and 8, and again in the late afternoon, between 4 and 6. During these windows, the airflow pulses were strong enough to extinguish an unshielded candle if held near the shaft opening. Outside these windows, the breathing continued but weakened, becoming barely perceptible except in the deepest galleries below 500 feet. Hackett descended with a pocket barometer, a relatively new instrument at the time, which measured atmospheric pressure with a column of mercury. At the surface, the barometer read 30.1 inches. At 200 feet, it read 30.3. At 400 feet, 30.5. At the bottom of the shaft, nearly 600 feet down, it read 30.8 inches. This was expected. Atmospheric pressure increases with depth due to the weight of the air column above. What was not expected was how the readings changed over the course of a single hour. At 6 in the morning, standing at the 500-foot level, Hackett recorded a pressure of 30.6 inches. He remained in place, watching the mercury. Over the next 20 minutes, it rose to 30.7, then fell back to 30.6. The cycle repeated. The air pressure at depth was oscillating. He returned to the surface and took measurements there. The surface barometer showed no such oscillation. Pressure remained stable at 30.1 inches throughout the morning. Whatever was happening, it was confined to the mine itself. Hackett consulted his logs from the previous weeks. The strongest breathing periods aligned with the greatest temperature differences between surface and depth. In early morning, the surface air was cold, often near freezing. The mine, insulated by hundreds of feet of rock, remained at a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. In late afternoon, the surface warmed, but not enough to match the mine's temperature. The differential remained, and with it, the breathing continued. Some of the miners began refusing to work during the peak breathing hours. They reported headaches, a sensation of pressure behind the eyes, and a ringing in the ears that persisted for hours after ascending. Others timed their shifts to avoid the periods of stillness, the brief windows when the breathing paused. During those moments, the air felt wrong, heavier, closer, as if the mine were holding its breath before inhaling again. One miner, a Cornishman named Trevelyan, refused to descend past 300 feet during the morning shift. He claimed the breathing was strongest in the lower galleries and that the pressure made it difficult to think clearly. Hackett dismissed this as superstition until he experienced it himself. Standing at the bottom of the shaft during a strong inhalation cycle, he felt a tightness in his chest, not painful but present, as if the air were being pulled from his lungs before he could exhale it fully. The mine was not dangerous. No one had been injured. No structural damage had occurred. But the men no longer trusted the shaft. And Hackett, despite his skepticism, could not explain what they were experiencing. By November, the breathing had intensified. What began as a faint movement of lantern flames now stirred dust from the tramway rails and caused loose papers in the foreman's office, located near the shaft opening, to lift and flutter without wind. The cycles remained consistent, 30 seconds in, 10 seconds still, 30 seconds out, but the force behind them had grown. Hackett ordered thermometers installed at multiple depths, surface level, 200 feet, 400 feet, and 600 feet. The results confirmed his suspicion. Surface temperature varied throughout the day, dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn and rising to 45 degrees by afternoon. At 400 feet, the temperature held steady at 51 degrees. At 600 feet, 52 degrees. The mine interior was thermally stable, but the surface was not. During the coldest part of the morning, the temperature difference between surface and depth reached 24 degrees. This was when the breathing was strongest. As the surface warmed through midday, the differential narrowed to 7 degrees and the breathing weakened. By late afternoon, as the surface cooled again, the cycle resumed. But temperature alone did not explain the regularity of the pulses or the pressure fluctuations Hackett had measured. Something else was amplifying the effect. One morning, descending to the 400-foot level, Hackett noticed that the airflow direction reversed as he passed through 300 feet. Above that depth, air flowed downward into the shaft, drawn by the cooler surface conditions. Below 300 feet, air flowed upward, pushed by the warmer conditions at depth. The transition point was not fixed. It shifted throughout the day, rising during warm afternoons and descending during cold mornings. This reversal created a zone of neutral pressure, a boundary where the upward and downward flows met and cancelled each other. Hackett stood in that zone and felt nothing. No wind, no movement. But 20 feet above or below, the airflow resumed, sometimes strong enough to lift fine dust into visible clouds. The miners began reporting auditory phenomena. At certain depths, during peak breathing periods, they heard a low hum, barely perceptible but persistent, like the sound of distant machinery. It was not machinery. The mine had no active ventilation fans, no pumps running near the affected galleries. The sound seemed to come from the shaft itself, resonating through the timber framework and the rock walls. Hackett suspected resonance, but could not prove it. He knew that organ pipes produced sound through standing waves of air, and that the length of the pipe determined the pitch. The mine shaft was 600 feet deep and 10 feet in diameter, a massive vertical tube of confined air. If the breathing cycles were driving oscillations in that air column, resonance could occur, amplifying certain frequencies while damping others. He lacked the instruments to measure this directly, but the hum persisted, loudest at depths between 300 and 400 feet, where the airflow reversal occurred. Some miners refused to work in those sections. claiming the sound made them uneasy. Others adapted, timing their work to avoid the peak hours when the hum was strongest. By mid-November, the breathing had become an operational concern. Shifts were shortened. Certain galleries were closed during morning hours. Productivity declined. The mine owners, receiving reports from Hackett, dispatched an engineering consultant from Chicago to investigate. To understand what was happening at Riverside, it is necessary to understand what should have been happening in a mine shaft of that depth and design. In a static vertical shaft with no active ventilation, airflow is driven primarily by thermal convection. Warm air, being less dense, rises. Cool air, being more dense, sinks. If the air at depth is warmer than the air at the surface, an upward flow develops naturally. If the surface air is warmer, the flow reverses, and cool surface air descends into the shaft. This process is slow and continuous, not pulsed or cyclical. In a well-designed mine, the temperature difference between surface and depth is small enough that natural convection provides only minimal airflow, insufficient for ventilation, but enough to prevent the buildup of stagnant pockets. Active ventilation, fans, bellows, or furnace-driven drafts, is required to move large volumes of air through the workings. Riverside had no active ventilation system in 1890. The shaft was open to the surface, and a secondary tunnel, dug for emergency egress, provided a second opening 300 feet from the main shaft. This configuration should have created a simple convection loop, air entering through one opening, circulating through the galleries, and exiting through the other. The process should have been continuous, unidirectional, and imperceptible to the miners. But that is not what was observed. The airflow at Riverside was bidirectional, reversing direction multiple times per hour. It was pulsed, with distinct inhalation and exhalation phases, and it was strongest during periods of maximum temperature differential, when convection should have been steady and continuous. Something was modulating the natural convection process, turning a continuous flow into a rhythmic oscillation. The engineer from Chicago, a man named Whitmore, arrived with instruments designed to measure airflow velocity, temperature gradients, and pressure differentials with greater precision than Hackett's pocket barometer. Whitmore spent 3 days at the mine, descending to each level and taking measurements at hourly intervals. He confirmed Hackett's observations. Surface temperature varied by 17 degrees over a 24-hour period. Temperature at depth varied by less than 1 degree. The barometric pressure at the surface fluctuated by 0.2 inches of mercury, typical of normal weather changes. Pressure at depth fluctuated by 0.4 inches, double the surface variation. This inversion puzzled Whitmore. Barometric pressure is driven by atmospheric conditions, weather fronts, temperature changes, and altitude. It should not fluctuate more at depth than at the surface. Yet the data was clear. The mine interior was experiencing pressure swings that exceeded surface conditions. Whitmore suspected that the shaft itself was acting as a pressure reservoir, storing and releasing air in response to surface changes. When surface pressure dropped, air flowed out of the mine, drawn by the pressure differential. When surface pressure rose, air flowed back in. But this process should have been gradual, not pulsed. He examined the geometry of the shaft and the secondary tunnel. The main shaft descended vertically for 600 feet. The secondary tunnel branched off at 300 feet and ascended at a shallow angle, exiting the surface 300 feet away. This created a U-shaped airflow path with 2 vertical sections of unequal length. Whitmore realized that this configuration could support oscillatory airflow under the right conditions. If the air column in the main shaft was cooler and denser than the air in the secondary tunnel, a pressure imbalance would develop, driving air downward through the main shaft and upward through the tunnel. As the air moved, friction and turbulence would slow it, allowing the pressure to equalize. The flow would stop, then reverse, creating a pendulum effect. But oscillations of that nature damped quickly, dying out within a few cycles unless energy was continuously added to the system. Whitmore needed to identify the energy source sustaining the breathing. Whitmore installed a continuous recording barometer at the 500-foot level. a device that traced pressure changes onto a rotating drum of paper. Over 48 hours, the drum recorded a clear pattern. Pressure at depth rose and fell in cycles lasting approximately 70 seconds, 30 seconds of rising pressure, 10 seconds of stability, 30 seconds of falling pressure. The amplitude of the swings was small, less than 0.1 inches of mercury, but the regularity was unmistakable. He compared this record to surface barometric data from the nearest weather station, located 12 miles away in Marquette. Surface pressure changed slowly, rising or falling over hours in response to passing weather systems. There was no correlation between surface pressure trends and the 70-second cycles observed at depth. The mine was generating its own pressure oscillations, independent of surface conditions. Whitmore then measured airflow velocity using an anemometer, a device with rotating cups that turned faster in stronger winds. At the shaft opening, during a strong inhalation phase, he recorded a velocity of 18 feet per minute, a barely perceptible breeze. At the 400-foot level, velocity reached 32 feet per minute, strong enough to be felt on exposed skin. At the 600-foot level, it dropped to 12 feet per minute. The fastest airflow occurred not at the shaft opening or at the bottom, but at an intermediate depth where the upward and downward convection currents met. This suggested that the oscillation was driven by interactions between air masses of different temperatures, not by pressure changes alone. Whitmore also measured the temperature of the rock walls at multiple depths. At the surface, the rock was cold, matching the ambient air temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. At 200 feet, the rock had warmed to 45 degrees. At 400 feet, 50 degrees. At 600 feet, 52 degrees. Rock was acting as a thermal reservoir, absorbing heat from the Earth's interior and releasing it slowly into the mine air. The thermal inertia of the rock meant that its temperature responded slowly to surface conditions, lagging by hours or even days. When the surface air cooled overnight, the rock at depth remained warm, creating a temperature gradient that drove convection. When the surface air warmed during the day, the gradient weakened but did not reverse, because the rock temperature changed too slowly. This lag between surface and subsurface temperatures was the key. It meant that the thermal gradient persisted even as surface conditions changed, providing a continuous energy source to sustain the oscillations. Whitmore sketched a diagram of the air column, dividing it into layers based on temperature. Cold surface air occupied the top of the shaft, dense and heavy. Warm air from the depths occupied the bottom, light and buoyant. Between them, at the 300-foot level, lay a transitional zone where temperatures and densities were nearly equal. This transition zone acted as a hinge. When cold surface air descended into the shaft, it pushed the transition zone downward, compressing the warm air below. Pressure at depth increased, slowing the descent until the cold air stopped. The compressed warm air then pushed back, driving the transition zone upward. Pressure at depth decreased, and the cycle repeated. The 70-second period of the oscillation was determined by the length of the air column and the speed of sound in air, which dictated how quickly pressure changes propagated through the shaft. The mine was behaving like a Helmholtz resonator, a cavity with an opening that resonates at a specific frequency determined by its volume and the dimensions of the opening. But Whitmore still needed to explain why the oscillations persisted instead of damping out. The answer, he concluded, lay in the continuous influx of cold surface air during morning hours. Every time the air column approached equilibrium, a fresh pulse of cold air entered from the surface, reinitializing the cycle. The mine was not a closed system. It was open to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere was constantly changing. In December, Whitmore returned to Chicago and drafted a detailed report for the mine owners. His analysis drew on principles of fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and acoustics, fields that were still developing in the late 19th century. He outlined a mechanism by which the Riverside mine had become a self-sustaining oscillator, driven by thermal convection and amplified by the geometry of the shaft. The process, he explained, began each morning as surface temperatures dropped. Cold, dense air accumulated at the shaft opening, then spilled over the edge and descended. This descent was not smooth. The falling air accelerated until it encountered warmer, lighter air rising from below. The collision created turbulence, mixing the two air masses and forming a transitional layer at mid-depth. As the cold air continued to descend, it compressed the warm air below, raising the pressure at the bottom of the shaft. This pressure increase slowed the descent and eventually reversed it, pushing the cold air back upward. The cycle repeated, but with each oscillation, energy was lost to friction and turbulence. Without a continuous energy input, the oscillations would have damped within minutes. The energy input came from two sources. First, the thermal gradient between surface and depth provided a constant supply of buoyant warm air from below. Second, the diurnal cycle of surface temperature ensured that cold air continued to enter the shaft each morning, reinitializing the oscillation before it could fully damp. Whitmore also identified the role of the secondary tunnel. Because it exited the surface 300 feet from the main shaft, it created an asymmetric airflow path. Air entering the main shaft had to travel 600 feet down, then 300 feet up through the tunnel to exit. Air entering the tunnel traveled only 300 feet down before reaching the galleries. This asymmetry caused the two air columns to oscillate out of phase, with one column inhaling while the other exhaled. The result was a breathing pattern that appeared to originate from the mine itself, when in fact it was driven by the interaction of two coupled oscillators, the main shaft and the secondary tunnel, each responding to the same thermal gradient but with different natural frequencies. Whitmore calculated the natural frequency of the main shaft based on its length and diameter. For a vertical tube 600 feet long and 10 feet in diameter, the fundamental resonance frequency was approximately 0.014 Hz, corresponding to a period of 70 seconds. This matched the observed breathing cycle exactly. He also calculated the amplitude of the pressure oscillations based on the temperature differential and the density difference between cold surface air and warm mine air. His predictions matched the measurements taken with the recording barometer, confirming that the phenomenon was entirely physical, driven by well-understood principles of convection, resonance, and pressure dynamics. The mine owners were relieved. There was no structural defect, no hazardous gas accumulation, no threat to the miners. The breathing was a natural consequence of the mine's depth and geometry, amplified by the seasonal temperature cycle. It could be mitigated by installing active ventilation to disrupt the oscillations, but it posed no immediate danger. Whitmore recommended installing a small steam-powered fan at the surface to provide continuous, unidirectional airflow through the shaft. This would break the resonance cycle and eliminate the breathing. The mine owners approved the recommendation, and the fan was installed in early 1891. The breathing stopped. The Riverside mine had become, by accident, a natural thermoacoustic oscillator, a system in which thermal gradients drive oscillating airflows through a confined space. Such systems were rare in practice, but well understood in theory by the late 19th century. Organ pipes, steam whistles, and gas flames all relied on similar principles, converting thermal energy into acoustic oscillations. In the mine, the thermal gradient between cold surface air and warm subsurface air created a density difference that drove convection. The vertical shaft, with its fixed length and diameter, imposed a natural resonance frequency on the oscillating air column. The secondary tunnel, exiting at a different elevation, coupled to the main shaft and created an asymmetric airflow path, sustaining the oscillation. Three key factors made the breathing possible. First, the shaft was deep enough to develop a significant temperature difference between surface and depth. A shallow mine would not have produced sufficient thermal gradient. Second, the shaft was open to the atmosphere, allowing cold surface air to enter freely and reinitialize the oscillation. A sealed mine would have reached equilibrium and stopped breathing. Third, the thermal inertia of the surrounding rock ensured that the subsurface temperature remained stable even as surface conditions changed, maintaining the gradient over time. The pressure fluctuations observed at depth were a consequence of the oscillating airflow. As air moved downward, it compressed the air below, raising the pressure. As air moved upward, it expanded the air above, lowering the pressure. The magnitude of these pressure swings was small, but in the confined space of the mine, they were sufficient to cause physiological effects, headaches, ear ringing, and a sensation of chest tightness, particularly during strong inhalation phases. The auditory hum reported by some miners was a direct manifestation of the resonance. The oscillating air column produced standing waves at specific frequencies determined by the length of the shaft. These waves amplified certain tones while suppressing others, creating a low-frequency hum that propagated through the rock and timber framework of the mine. The phenomenon was not unique to Riverside. Similar effects had been observed in deep mines across Europe and North America, though rarely documented with the precision that Whitmore applied. In most cases, mine operators attributed the breathing to changes in weather or barometric pressure, not recognizing the role of thermal gradients and resonance. Riverside became one of the first documented cases in American mining literature where the mechanism was fully explained. The installation of the ventilation fan in 1891 disrupted the resonance by introducing a continuous, unidirectional airflow that overwhelmed the natural convection currents. The breathing ceased, and the mine returned to normal operation. Workers no longer reported pressure symptoms or auditory phenomena. The galleries at depth remained accessible at all hours. But the memory of the breathing persisted. Older miners, recounting their experiences decades later, described the sensation of standing in a mine that seemed alive, inhaling and exhaling with a regularity that felt almost deliberate. They spoke of the unease it produced, not from fear of collapse or gas, but from the realization that they were working inside a system governed by forces larger and slower than human perception, forces that responded to the planet itself, to the cycles of temperature and pressure that moved invisibly through rock and air. The Riverside mine continued operating until 1908, when the iron ore reserves were exhausted. The shaft was sealed, and the surface structures dismantled. Today, nothing remains but a depression in the ground where the main shaft once opened to the sky. But the principles that made the mine breathe remain, active in deep shafts and tunnels around the world. Engineers now design ventilation systems to account for thermal convection, barometric oscillations, and resonance effects, recognizing that any sufficiently deep vertical space can become a natural oscillator under the right conditions. The men who worked at Riverside in 1890 did not have this understanding. They entered the mine each day knowing only that the air moved in ways it should not have moved, that pressure built and released on a schedule no one had set. They worked within a system that breathed, not because it was alive, but because it was connected, through 600 feet of rock and air, to the slow rhythms of the atmosphere above. In the industrial age, workers descended into machines of stone and iron, into spaces carved by human hands but governed by physical laws that preceded and outlasted those hands. The mine shaft that breathed was one such space, a place where the boundary between the engineered and the natural blurred, where men worked inside a system that responded not to their labor, but to the turning of the earth itself.